nobody's done more to inspire people to make these changes in their yards than Doug Tallamy. He is, I call him the guru of backyard biodiversity. Doug, I hope you're okay with that.
I'm not a guru.
He knows a lot about this kind of stuff. That's what I'll say. And I've learned a lot from him, and he has really inspired Aspetuck Land Trust and other land trusts and other people throughout this country to do this important work. And so I'm really pleased, and I want to thank Doug for joining us tonight from Delaware. Take it away, Doug. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It is a pleasure to be with you tonight. I want to expand on what David was talking about, but before I do that, I want to emphasize what the Aspetuck Land Trust is doing. They have a vision. It's a very big vision for the landscapes within the Green Corridor. And in fact, the Land Trust is leading the effort to save the life around us, and they're doing that by saving the land around us. You got to do that before its ecological integrity is destroyed. So I want to thank the Aspetuck Land Trust personally, but we all need to thank them because the work they're doing is, it's vital to all of us. It's essential. And that's why I want to talk to you a little bit tonight to try to convince you that it is essential. And I don't have a lot of time to do that, so we have to compress an awful lot of ideas. One of them is that nature really is comprised of a series of very specialized relationships. But the way we humans blunder around the environment, we haven't thought about that, and we tend to break up those relationships. So that means that the relationships in nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes primarily because we have not taken Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon, and Teddy got wind of that. So he went to the canyon and he stood on its lip and he looked out over the wonderful scenery and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process for creating the Grand Canyon National Park. It was easier back then. The problem today, though, of course, is that we don't have the opportunity to leave most of the United States as it was because there's only 5%, a generous 5%, that is left in anything close to its original pristine ecological state. And that's because we've logged it and we've tilled it and we've drained it and we've grazed it and paved it and otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and we have dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We've polluted our atmosphere and changed the climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, which are now running amok in our natural areas. In short, we have carved up the natural world into little fragments of its former self that are too small and too isolated to sustain. And by sustain, I don't mean for 5 years. I mean essentially forever, to sustain the species that run the ecosystems that support us. And we've done all these things because we thought our nest, planet Earth, was so big that we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And here are the headlines that David was talking about. The global insect decline, insect apocalypse is here. We've lost 3 billion birds in North America in just the last 50 years. As a matter of fact, the UN predicts we're going to lose 1 million species on the Earth in the next 20 years. I could go on with these horrible statistics, but that's not my goal tonight. I'm not here to talk about the pox that we visited upon the earth and thus upon all of our houses. I want to talk about a cure for that pox. And it's a cure that will involve a little bit of effort from a lot of people, but that effort will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to all the people. Let's return to this headline briefly. Insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, way back in 1987, E.O. Wilson, a very famous biologist from Harvard, told us what it would mean if we were to lose insects. Life as we know it depends almost entirely on insects. And if they were to disappear, so would most of the flowering plants. About 90% of our flowering plants would go extinct, which would change, it would alter energy flow through our terrestrial habitats so drastically that the food webs that support our animals, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, the mammals, would all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot due to the loss of insect decomposers. And of course, humans would not survive any of those changes. The good news, though, is that we can save our insects. We can save our birds. We can save nature itself. But in order to do that, we're going to have to do the types of things that the Aspetuck Land Trust is engaged in. We're going to have to change the way we landscape to accomplish those goals. Why? Well, let me just remind you, humans are a product of nature. We are part of it. We are not separate from it, and we cannot live without it because we depend on what we call ecosystem services. These are just a few of the services that we get from plants. How about oxygen? Important. They clean our water and slow its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants build our topsoil and hold it in place. They prevent floods. They dampen severe weather, on and on and on. What do animals do for us? Well, they primarily keep those plants happy. They provide pest control services for the plants. They pollinate nearly 90% of them. They disperse plant seeds and many other things. So designing landscapes for humans that destroy those ecosystem services really is not a long-term option. It's not even a short-term option. Now, there have been people throughout history who have recognized that we don't have a healthy relationship with the land. And one of the most famous, of course, is Aldo Leopold, wrote the Sand County Almanac. He recognized very early on that the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. And I have to say, we're not very good at doing that. So Aldo had a dream. He called it the land ethic. He recognized that we have to use the land. We have to farm it and lumber it and graze it and mine it and hunt on it. But he said we have to learn to do that without destroying local ecosystems. What has always, it surprised me, Aldo was a deep thinker, but he never talked about developing a land ethic where we actually live. It was always someplace else. And I'm not sure why that was. But I'm guessing that the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist was so deeply embedded in the culture then, and it's still deeply embedded in our culture today, that Aldo Leopold didn't recognize it as an option. Well, I'm going to argue that living with nature not only is an option, it is now probably the only viable option that is left to us. We simply have to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, or we will lose it and in turn lose ourselves. So where are we going to start? We're going to start with those landscapes that David was talking about. How about privately owned land? 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is in private hands. We cannot ignore private property if we're going to succeed in conservation. What are we going to conserve? Well, we're trying to rebuild nature in areas where we've already ripped it apart. And we have to do that for all parts of nature. But not all parts are equally important. So we want to focus on the most important aspects, the building blocks of nature first. And in terms of supporting food webs, it turns out that caterpillars really are essential in terms of passing the energy from plants to other animals. Caterpillars transfer more energy from plants than any other type of living being. And that means if you take caterpillars out of the environment, you have locked up the energy in plants and then you lose everything else. Let me give you a few quick examples. Carolina chickadees, we've studied them for some time. They rear their young almost exclusively on caterpillars. And it turns out that's true for most birds out there. Which means if you take the caterpillars away, you're going to lose the chickadees. They're not optional members of the chickadee diet. They're essential members of the chickadee diet. How many caterpillars are we talking about here? Well, thousands, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to make one clutch of chickadee. And again, this is typical for I guess it's 96% of the birds in North America. Which means we have to build landscapes that make caterpillars if we want birds. Birds are ecological indicators, by the way. If you don't have birds, you do not have a healthy ecosystem. Things are going downhill quickly. So we need to landscape for caterpillars. How do we do that? Well, we add caterpillars to the landscapes by adding the plants that make those caterpillars, which sounds easy, but there is a catch, and that is that all plants don't make caterpillars equally. So we have to add the plants that are good at it. It turns out that most caterpillars are really fussy about what they eat. They can only eat particular plants. So we have to add the plants that support the caterpillars, as many caterpillar species as we can, which means plant choice matters. You can't just pick any old plant from around the world. And I could expand on this for another hour, but I don't have time. So I'm just going to give you some examples of homeowners, people who have done this right in the middle of suburbia. Let's start with Margie and Dan Terpstra, who live in a little suburb of St. Louis. Their yard, they've got, I think, 0.6 acres, was thoroughly invaded with bush honeysuckle. It's the major invasive species out there. So the first thing they did was get rid of the honeysuckle. Then they planted a whole bunch of native plants. They also put in a water feature that they called a bubbler, Kirkwood, Missouri. That's where they live. So they installed this bubbler. They put in the native plants, and they have recorded 149 bird species right in their yard. 35 warbler species. At my house, we've got 10 acres in southeast Pennsylvania. We've only recorded 8 species. So the Terpstras are doing really well with their little property right there in the middle of suburbia. Can this work in urban yards? Well, let's go to Pam Carlson's yard, who lives in Chicago. As a matter of fact, she lives right next to the Chicago O'Hare Airport, right next to one of the runways. And this is what her backyard looks like. She lives on 1/10 of an acre. That is 3 times smaller than the average US lot. Again, it's right in the middle of Chicago, a half block from the Kennedy Expressway. There's absolutely no connectivity with her property and any preserved land. But she has added 60 native plant species and a water feature to her yard, and has recorded 116 species of birds, including a woodcock. If you want to see a woodcock, go to Chicago and stop by Pam's yard. I could go on, there's lots of examples. Every time somebody puts in the powerful native plants that support the life around them, that life comes. This really does work. But there are 3 keys to success that I think we need to focus on, and David mentioned one of them. Let's start with the lawn. We have to shrink the area that is in lawn because we've got too much of it. We got over 40 million acres of lawn, which is now bigger than the area of New England. So I suggest, and the lawn, of course, is a deadscape. It's not supporting anything. It looks nice, but it's not supporting anything. So I'm proposing that we cut that area in half. If we replant half the area that's now in lawn, we have 20 million acres to work with. And if we do it at home, we can call this new acreage Homegrown National Park, which will be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. You add up all those parks, that's still less than 20 million acres. So if we create Homegrown National Park, we're gonna have the biggest park in the country. Second important point that we need to think about is that not all native plants are equal in their ability to support the life around us. We found that just 5% of our native plants, and this is true anywhere in the country, are producing about 75% of the caterpillar food that drives these food webs. And I'm calling these plants keystone plants. So we need to build the ecosystem in our yard out of these keystone plants, and then we can diversify. Once we have these plants in place, we can diversify with other plants. So again, I want to emphasize, it's not just native versus non-native. We have to pick the most powerful natives in order to succeed. Here's the most powerful native in Connecticut, in the entire mid-Atlantic region, actually in the entire country. It's oaks. Genus Quercus, 557 species of caterpillars just in the mid-Atlantic states, and that includes Connecticut. If you compare it to a typical non-native tree like ginkgo that supports 0 caterpillars, the choice of which plant you're going to put in your yard ought to be pretty obvious. So where do you find out what the keystone species are for the county you live in, wherever it may be? You go to Native Plant Finder on the National Wildlife Federation website, put in your zip code, and the ranked list of woody and herbaceous plants will pop up for your county. They're ranked in terms of the number of caterpillar species that they support. So these are the top ranked woody plants, plant genera, and here are the top ranked herbaceous plant genera. But you know, it's a big list. It goes down for lots of species. So very handy tool. The old excuse of I don't know what to plant is gone. We do know what to plant now. The third important point is that using keystone species in your yard works, but only if you don't have a big problem from light pollution. It turns out that lights are a major cause of insect declines around the world. They kill insects in all these different ways by exhausting them, colliding with red hot bulbs, and then incinerating them, dehydration. Predators know to go to lights and pick off those insects. It blinds the insects and does a number of other things. So having lights in your yard, it's a one-way trip for most of the insects that go to those lights. 3 ways to reduce that. If you need a security light at your house, put a motion sensor on your security light so it only turns on when the bad man comes. And the first thing you're going to realize is that the bad man doesn't come very often. Next most important thing you can do is use a yellow light bulb. Yellow color is far less attractive to insects, and the least attractive type of light is a yellow LED bulb. We could slash insect mortality almost overnight just by changing our light bulbs and outdoor lighting. We've made, at least in my opinion, we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation. And the early years, I would say, is the last century. And the first is that we've assumed that nature's important, but not essential. You know, we like it, but we don't really need it. I was at the Cincinnati Zoo not all that long ago, well, pre-virus, and this was a wall-size poster that, you know, I see this and you hear this all the time. We need to save nature for future generations. We want our kids to appreciate the natural world. But to me, that suggests that we're saving nature for entertainment, valuable entertainment, but it's just for entertainment. It's much more important than that. We need to save wildlife. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. Sounds dramatic, but it's true. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, I mentioned this, but if we follow that assumption, then we restrict conservation efforts to the areas where there aren't any humans. And believe me, that's not very many areas these days, which means we've condemned those efforts to ultimate failure, because the areas we're conserving then would be too small and too isolated from each other in order to succeed in the long run. David Quammen has an excellent analogy between ecosystems and a Persian rug. This is a functional Persian rug. That is not 71 Persian rugs. That is 71 scraps, none of which are functioning as a Persian rug. And that, of course, is what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that terminology because it suggests there are places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every place has ecological significance, including your yard. So what we need to do, as David suggests, is put the plants back in our human-dominated landscapes, including where we live, where we work, where we play, and connect all of those isolated fragments, all of the places that the Aspetuck Land Trust is working to preserve, so that not only do we have connectivity where plants and animals can move back and forth, but they can also live in these new habitats that we're creating, which means with us. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to a few specialists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet. And I don't know why, because every person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. Who does not need a healthy environment? So that means every person, in my view anyway, has the responsibility of good Earth stewardship. And I sure wish we were teaching that from birth on. It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you really can save it where you live. Now, I like this approach because it empowers each one of us. And that's important. There are huge environmental issues out there today that a single person, it'd be very difficult for a single person to make a noticeable difference. If I said to you, I want you to solve climate change and I want to see the results tomorrow, it'd be tough. We wouldn't be able to do that. But if I said, I want you to plant an oak tree and I want to see it tomorrow, you could do it, I could see it, and we could all immediately see the things that start to use that oak tree. So this empowers each one of us to be an important component of the future of conservation. And it also shrinks the problem to something that's manageable. Don't worry about the entire planet's problems. That you'll get overwhelmed immediately. Just worry about the land you own. Get rid of the invasive species, shrink your lawn, plant those powerhouse plants, build a pollinator garden. That's it. If everybody does that, we're 85% done. So as property owners, or if you don't own property, as a volunteer, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. And whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate. So here's a message from my grandchildren. You are nature's best hope. Thanks very much.
Does anyone have any questions they want to line up in the Q&A? I see it. Paige Lyons says, is there a way to involve large-scale developers?
Well, sure. We have to talk to them. You know, I go around and I talk to a lot of people, but it's always people who invite me, and large-scale developers never have. But they're selling a product. If everybody refused to buy a home that wasn't landscaped in the way we're talking about, developers would catch on very quickly. And you know, the needle is moving. There are more and more townships that are requiring a higher percentage of native plants in new developments. The entire culture is changing. I've been at this for more than 10 years, and I can see noticeable differences. The demand for native plants from the general public, but also in large-scale landscaping, is through the roof. So I do see a culture shift, and developers will follow that eventually. But it's market-driven. So we, as home buyers, get to demand what we're going to settle for.
Great. We have one other question. Alice Eli asks, what do you recommend is the best choice for replacing a lot of burning bush? Winged euonymus. Here in deer country, so much I have tried to use has been demolished.
Yeah, deer are a terrible problem, and they've encouraged the invasive species problem, like burning bush and bush honeysuckle and all the things that the deer don't eat. Tips the competitive balance against the natives. But landscaping with plants that deer won't eat isn't going to solve the problem, because they're also plants largely that the insects that drive the ecosystems won't eat. I mean, I could say, well, plant a bunch of spice bush, the deer don't like it. And if you look at the understories in so many places, that's about the only native plant that's there. But we need a diversity of native plants. So the real solution that you're looking for here is to control our deer problem. We need to get the numbers down. But witch hazel is another good one that deer don't they certainly don't favor. But I will tell you, a hungry deer eats anything. The understory of a healthy understory is comprised of not just shrubs. I mean, I'd recommend viburnum, but the deer certainly do like viburnum. But a healthy understory is comprised of young trees, young canopy trees that are waiting their chance to take off. So black cherry is a very important canopy tree, and deer typically, they will eat it, but only when they're very hungry. They don't like that very much. And it will sit there as a small tree in a shaded area for quite a while. But we can't ignore the oaks and the hickories and the walnuts and the other things that the deer do eat, while we're getting rid of the burning bush. So it is a conundrum. When I try to keep something around at home, I don't fence the whole property. I just use a deer cage until it's up past the point where it can handle some deer herbivory. But I won't minimize the problem. It's a huge issue.
So I see one other question from Jackie B, and she says, we should find ways to make lists of keystone species brief and available. Not sure if that's a question or a statement. But
could you read it again?
We should find ways to make lists of keystone species brief and available.
Right. Well, that's what that website is supposed to be for. Any county in the entire country has access to the list of the top ranked plant. Of course, the ones at the beginning of the list are the keystone plants. Could it be more user friendly? I'm sure it could be, and we're trying to improve access to it and how easily you can use it. That's beyond my area of expertise, but you certainly can make those lists available locally, and I'm sure the Land Trust can do that for you. Right, David?
That's right. We have a list of native plants that we've compiled on our website as well that Mary Ellen has put together. So we do have lists.
There you go.
For some plants.
Jackie B just also said the NWF website is certainly could be much more user friendly. Well, we're going to help. We're going to help you, Jackie. So keep in touch. Any other questions out there? Okay, here we go. Jill Brandt wants to know, Sydney Brandt is curious when the off-leash dog, off-leash dog trail will reopen. Well, we're going to address that soon, Sydney. So hold on. And any more questions for Doug? That presentation is always so valuable. Anyone? Thank you, Doug. So I guess now